I received Assassin's Creed 2 as a gift several years ago, but never completed it. AC2 and Brotherhood seem to be the most revered among all the games in the series by many people. Of course, not everyone will agree, but this is a frequently shared sentiment in the community. I decided to train my critical eye on one of these games, and I chose AC2 over Brotherhood simply because I own the former and not the latter. For the sake of being upfront, I think there are very many problems with this game, resulting in it being grossly unsuccessful. Of course, I'm referring to design success, not commercial. I think the reverence is highly unjustified, but I can understand why people love this game, and more generally the series. Navigating through, atop, and around a historically relevant environment as a fictional assassin is fascinating, but mapping the gameplay onto the setting and context was, en masse, poorly executed. Assassin's Creed 2 released in 2009 for the Xbox 360 and PS3. This is a critique, meaning I won't be offering a fair review pointing out all of the good and the bad. I will be highlighting what the game doesn't do well, how it could potentially improve, and a few good aspects. It will also contain spoilers for the entire game, and I'll be getting into spoilers right away, so this is your final warning. And you'll notice that the footage is a bit choppy. I played this game in its normal condition, it was just how the footage was captured, so it doesn't affect my critique. Check the description for the full explanation. Assassin's Creed 2 opens with a young and brash Ezio it opens with an alien being born to a human being. This child does not have an umbilical cord, so it must be an extraterrestrial imposter species of some kind. And how is there a memory of being a baby? The hippocampus doesn't start recording long-term memories until 3 or 4 years old. Anyway, Ezio is gallivanting through the streets being charming and troublesome. The neighborhood bully, Vieri, is his rival and they end up fighting. From this point on to where Ezio's father and brothers are killed is the first tutorial. This brawl teaches you basic fighting movements, and you'll learn in other tutorials how to climb buildings, pick up bodies, and the benefit of haystacks. One of the first objectives is to follow your mother to Leonardo's workshop. This is an absolutely boring mission. I'll talk more about mission types later, but I do want to mention a quick nitpick on movement. There are 5 movement speeds in AC2, but none of them match the speed of the NPCs. When following a walking NPC, holding the right stick all the way forward moves too fast, and holding the stick slightly forward moves too slow. The effect is similar in running or jogging NPCs as well, meaning that the player must alternate between movement speeds to stay near the NPC. I can't imagine Ubisoft thought this was engaging, so I don't know why this feature is in the game. The first segment of extended freerunning, where the game really starts, is when Ezio must deliver some parcels to his father's associates. It isn't a terribly deep mission, but it passes because if a player is brand new to the series, all they really have to focus on is learning how to manage using the right trigger, the A button, and the 2 sticks. This can be a bit tricky at first because there's a problem that plagues this entire game: imprecision and unresponsiveness. The freerunning and combat, which are really the only 2 things in this game, suffer from not being able to control exactly what Ezio is doing. This is how freerunning suffers. When moving about an environment, holding right trigger allows faster movement and holding A executes the climbing and jumping movements. In a game like this, some magnetism is necessary to keep the flow smooth. If the freerunning was calibrated in a way that made Ezio perform precisely what the player input, it would be a mess. If the engine considered the exact angle and position of the camera and the exact direction of the stick, frustration wouldn't be infrequent because if the player wanted to run across one of the narrow wires and wasn't perfect with their placement, Ezio would constantly be leaping off. Including magnetism was necessary, but that's not where the problem lies. The problem lies in the responsiveness of Ezio. One would think that an assassin that traipses on rooftops for a living would be rather nimble, but he controls like a tank in some aspects, having very rounded movements and turns. Say I was running on a narrow beam, and the beam ends at a platform, then terminating at a wall. I want to take a left the moment I reach the platform. Even attempting to finely tune the turn, carefully releasing A at the correct moment, and using the right trigger properly isn't sufficient. One likely possibility is that A and right trigger will persist and Ezio will attempt a wall run. Let's say that Ezio stops on the platform without doing anything else. That's exactly what I wanted, right? Yeah, but now I have to properly orient him so that holding A and RT won't propel him at some obnoxious angle because the game doesn't react fast enough to register a quick change in direction, which a free-running assassin should be able to do. Assassin's Creed 2 is obsessed with having a seamless flow, which isn't reprehensible, but it invades on the efficacy of player input. Having a system which grants more responsive movement over one that grants flows would be superior because the amount of detriments caused by the latter system are too common. Running into a wall to no effect twice before having to completely halt inputs on the controller to then reorient Ezio and continue moving is unacceptable. He leaps at random directions at random times, completely unpredictably when free running. I wish I could talk more about this without being extremely redundant, because this is one of the major issues with the game that really detracts from the game feel. It makes me feel like I'm holding a controller and manipulating a character in a video game, which is oftentimes the opposite effect that players should be experiencing. It feels like I'm too often fighting the A button and the right trigger and the camera to do what I want. However, if they all executed inputs as soon as they were committed, this issue would be almost completely curtailed. This amount of responsiveness I propose and the amount of magnetism currently in the game could peacefully coexist. It would reward players that become technically skilled at the game and could also lead to some impressive feats and displays of finesse using Ezio, whereas really any player's gameplay would look almost identical now because it's just so sloppy and sluggish. The contrast comes in here. When it works, it really works. The flows do actually feel smooth, which seems like what Ubisoft are going for, but it happens far too seldom to warrant its addition to the game. The flows are too few and far apart and short-lived. These traits apply equally to the combat. One thing I find commendable about the combat in this game is that it's not abundantly shallow like you will find in other games like Batman Arkham City, where pressing the counter button can get you through an entire enemy encounter. Trying that in AC2 would yield so much time wasted just waiting for the opponents to attack. There is in fact a taunt button that causes the opponent to attack you if you feel that nothing is happening. I have a feeling that this was included later in development because there would be no need for a taunt function if the combat was intrinsically engaging. It's essentially a cop-out. Arguing that the combat can become boring and uneventful can be countered by arguing to use the taunt button more often, but there shouldn't be a taunt button to begin with. Another nice touch of the combat is that guards will mostly act like real people. If one guard is attacking you, another one won't hesitate to do the same. I say mostly because standoffs are typical, where a group of 6 guards will stand still instead of constantly attempting to kill Ezio. This happens on almost every occasion. An aspect that is decently well considered is variety in the guards. They each have a distinct visual design, weapons, movements, and other traits that make each guard archetype unique. There are heavily armored ones that can't free run and have polearms as weapons. There are agiles that can dodge many attacks and in return attack quickly, but use low damage weapons like a Quinquedilla. Those are just some examples, so throwing these different types of guards at the player should make a dynamic battleground, right? Well, it should, but it doesn't feel that way. They all bleed together like a cup of murky water at the end of a watercolor painting session, and they all feel samey. Seekers, the armed guards that have either a spear or a polearm, stick out the most, though, because of how much of a nuisance they are to fight, and this is basically where the compliments to the combat stop. There is a dodge function, but it suffers from the imprecision and unresponsiveness I mentioned earlier. If you wait until the Seeker begins his attack animation to start dodging back or to the side, it's probably too late. If the player notices the beginning of the animation and reacts quickly enough to press the dodge button in the desired direction, they should be rewarded by avoiding damage. This isn't always the case though, meaning the player is prone to taking damage when A, it's not their fault, and 2, they would have avoided taking damage if not for the game's grogginess when executing an input. I want to compare the slowness in this game to the slowness in Dark Souls. Calling the combat in Dark Souls unresponsive would be a misunderstanding of how it works. Pressing the attack button begins the animation instantly, but the character is just beginning their attack, so proper timing is necessary. It's identical every time, so it can be reliably calculated. Dodging in AC2 is only remotely like this. It is very difficult to know exactly how far, linearly or radially, Ezio will travel, or even when exactly the dodge will start. The duration between pressing A and witnessing the dodge begin on screen feels variable. Whether it is indeed instant or not is irrelevant. This can be corrected by either having a set distance that Ezio travels on every single dodge, or having the dodge start and end precisely when the player depresses and releases the button with the no tails on either end. This also translates to the Seeker's attack sequence. They have a combo that can last up to 3 strikes. Once Ezio is hit by the first one, he's stun locked and is forced to endure all the hits until the combo ends. Now, there is a controversy when it comes to what is fair to the player and what is not. One side posits that getting hit by all 3 strikes is fair because it was the player's fault getting hit in the first place, while the other camp argues that each strike should be considered an independent opportunity to avoid taking damage. There is no cut and dry answer to this. It's all contextual, but an assassin should be able to elude a sequence like that. Therefore, the player should be able to do so given that they have the proper reaction time. It's simply frustrating feeling like the attacks are so slow that you should be able to escape the combo, but you can't. However, the guards should not be able to elude a combo because they're just guards, not trained assassins. This wouldn't imbalance the gameplay because these enemies are heavily armored anyway. Another imprecise feature is moving from attacking one enemy to another. Consider this example. You parry the attack of one guard and decide to start attacking a different guard immediately after. The way the magnetism works in combat doesn't always snap to the correct enemy. Generally, combat is dull. Weapon differentiation is praised from what I've heard and read from other sources. Killing animations and weapon type add freshness to the combat and makes it more interesting as a result. I think it's true that it does make the combat more interesting, but it doesn't make the combat interesting. Apologizing for punching someone in the face is more polite, but it doesn't make punching someone in the face polite. Really, the same tactics can be used for a falchion and for a hammer. The only difference there is the ability to parry, and that's not much of a difference. Small weapons have even less internal differentiation. It all comes down to the movesets and attributes. Movesets are largely the same, and very few weapons actually have a highly unique trait. The best example I can think of is the spear being able to sweep, but you have to scavenge that from a guard. You don't have direct access to it. This is how I think weapons and therefore combat variety can improve. Some weapons are truly distinct, but they're not treated that way. Offering real incentives for the player to choose one death instrument over another would personalize playstyle, encourage weapon switching, and spice up repeat playthroughs. The hammer should have a benefit characteristic of its nature, like having a chance to break armor, consequently making that particular guard easier to damage. Or it could have a chance to break a limb. If the weapon arm is affected, the guard would have to switch to the less dominant arm, translating to more strikes that miss their mark and inflict less damage on Ezio. If the empty arm is affected, possibly blocking Ezio's attacks would be successful less often. If the leg is broken, the guard would move a lot slower and be able to dodge few of Ezio's attacks. This could make them easier to attack, and in a large group of enemies, the player could move far away so the fully capable guards follow him, reducing the amount of guards attacking the player simultaneously, leaving the injured for last. Implementing left-handed guards would add interest to the assortment. Adding a chance to induce bleeding by slicing an enemy would make affected guards lose health slowly over time. This wouldn't work on more armored guards, but is certainly still a trait worth using the weapon for. Small weapons, barring the cestus, would have a higher critical hit possibility, instantly killing the guard despite the amount of health he has. Small weapons have the advantage of being able to fit through chinks in armor, so this effect would persist equally across all guard archetypes. It would be ideal, of course, for almost every weapon to have a different moveset, motivating players to swap between all of the weapons. On the topic of swapping weapons, it's stupid that you can't switch your weapons at any blacksmith. Instead, you have to go all the way back to the villa or buy a new weapon. That's just plain dumb. I don't think I have to waste any more time explaining why. I'm not saying all of these are excellent ideas that have no reason not to be in the game, but I think they're valid enough to show that more could have been done with the weapons to better the combat without taking from the game as a whole. Dyes for robes are in the game, but they're not woven into the fabric of the gameplay at all. Here are some examples of how it can improve replacing the current armor system. I thought of two. The first is a robe system where an entire robe has characteristics that define its use. These are 5 samples. 1. An armor robe. This one would offer greater resistance and armor protection, but movement would be hindered by making Ezio run slower, jump not as far, etc. 2. A lightweight robe. Basically opposite of the armor robe, it would have greater movement capability, higher than the default or base stats, but would have less armor protection. 3. A notoriety robe. The appearance of it would be closer to what civilians wear, so notoriety builds slower and Ezio's less likely to be pursued when notoriety is maxed out. It would have less armor protection, but standard movement speeds. 4. A faction benefit robe. This one could possibly collude with the notoriety robe, but it would have courtesans, thieves, and mercenaries operate longer. I don't know what the contextual explanation for it would be. perhaps Ezio would be sporting a surprisingly pleasant cologne. 5. Finally, a stealth robe. Guards would be less likely to see Ezio, and he would have to be closer to be spotted by one, and it would have base armor protection and movement. The drawback is he could only use small weapons. Pulling out a warhammer wouldn't be very incognito. The second system is using pieces that all have specific functions. There's some overlap between these two systems. Obviously, only one of these systems could be in the game at once. In this system, there are 3 piece types: greaves and gloves, torso, and boots. 1. Gloves and greaves would be grouped together. One would let you fall further and still let you grab a ledge, avoiding falling to your death. In this case, falling an infinite distance and still being able to grab a ledge would be removed from the game. This is absurd anyway. And another one would allow you to pickpocket civilians without them ever noticing. It would be made out of a material with less friction. 2. The different torsos share the same attributes discussed in the robe system, featuring trade-offs between armor, conspicuousness, movement, and faction benefit. I don't understand how a guard could throw a stone so powerfully that it would travel 3 stories high against gravity to completely dismantle a free runner off the side of a building, but another torso could make the tolerance for this higher, increasing the amount of rocks it would take to make Ezio fall. On a side note, I think it's great that it's harder to escape from guards if they're nearby, but the contextualization just makes no sense. Third and final, boots could have a few options featuring ones with extra padding that are heavier as a result, reducing movement speed, but make you take less fall damage. Another pair would allow faster movement, but have less armor protection. Again, I'm not saying that these are perfect ideas, but it would individualize playstyles and let players roleplay to some degree on repeat playthroughs, e.g. playing as a heavily armored tank, or a stealthy character, or a gymnast. Although I'm aware that Assassin's Creed Unity addressed the robes, it definitely shouldn't have taken 7 games to do so. Whether it was done well is a question on which I'm ignorant because I haven't played the game. It seems to me that many games implement tailing and or escort missions when the developers want to lengthen the game but don't know how to in an interesting or engaging way. It's difficult for me to believe that a group of devs out there are genuinely enthralled by the idea of slowly following or guiding an NPC to a destination, possibly receiving an exposition dump. Well, it was difficult for me to believe that because I think I found the dev team with Assassin's Creed 2. They seem very content with recycling content. If they didn't recycle anything, or only very little, the game could have been less than half the length it is now. What all that extra content is doing now is just wasting the player's time. But it's not just tailing missions. Assassination missions are equally to blame. Excluding gimmick missions and assassin's tombs, which I'll return to later, there are only a few mission types: tailing and escort, item collection, races, and assassination. Multiple types are integrated occasionally, but it's not a sufficient modification to warrant labeling it as a unique mission type. Tailing and then assassinating, tailing and then item collecting, collecting a moving item, and assassinating multiple targets are clearly not different objectives. A few just happen to be glued together. They're all repeat appearances. In a 2009 interview, the creative director Patrice Desilets says that they have about 200 mission types because of the combinations. That number was likely derived by combining the mission types and every possible combination. 5.3 factorial results in 201, meaning that only just over 5 types are necessary to create hundreds of missions. But if one of those is assassination followed by a tailing segment, and another one is a tailing segment followed by an assassination, you have to wonder how many of those combinations will feel unique. Well, you don't have to wonder because it's in the game. The answer is very few. Starting with tailing, there is no mission or point in a mission where this is a valuable mechanic to have in AC2. I understand that one can appreciate the inherent value of free running in the different regions of the game, exploring the rooftops, but that's only the case if the player is moving swiftly on a route of either their own or the game's design. Ezio can't stray too far away from the target, else the player be desynchronized. You're moving too slow through the environment to be having much enjoyment because all the NPCs are walking. This is another instance of simply wasting the player's time. Marked on screen and on the minimap is the location of the target Ezio must tail. At any given point in time, the player can know where the target is, so staying close to them is useless. If the tether weren't present, as long as the player makes it to the destination, nothing else should matter. If the target takes 4 minutes to arrive, but the player spends 8 minutes exploring, they're knowingly spending extra time. And if the player fails a tailing mission somehow, and has to repeat it and knows how to get to the destination, they can't simply go there. They must once again follow very slowly. Even arguing that Ezio must remain close to hear whatever the target is saying isn't always true, because you can be on a rooftop as long as you're within the arbitrary distance the game sets and have the target in view. The NPC isn't even always with another person to talk to either. Not only is this mission type not worthy of being in the game, but it doesn't even make sense as it is. What the people are talking about while you're following them is completely inconsequential. I would be fascinated if I had to listen for hints of what these people were talking about to guide me to the next objective. For example, the Spaniard could have said something like, "Yes, my closest and most dearest assistant, Alessandro, has the only key to my secret lair of evilness. In case you did not know, he lives next door to the blacksmith near the piazza." I can understand my example is a bit cryptic, but it would imply that you would have to seek out Alessandro at his residence and confront him. Assassination memories are also largely the same, but they're definitely the most interesting ones. You get to traverse the city in any way you want and choose the route that you want to take. Just like in the tailing missions, there's a bargain that must be made between a safe and slow route on the streets or a more dynamic but dangerous route on the rooftops. It is certainly more captivating to be traveling atop the buildings, but you run the risk of encountering guards. They can become upset at you being there and will become hostile if you don't either get down or get out of their line of sight quick enough. The other option is to kill every guard that challenges your presence, but that's a quick way to build notoriety, making guards even more immediately hostile upon sighting. This is a balanced setup, and it's executed successfully, but it makes me wish something at this level of complexity was resolved in the street level as well. The only real threat of being down below is having the target notice your presence, which isn't always a bad thing. However, assassinations are required so frequently that the charm and the challenge degrade rather rapidly. Less than halfway through the game, every mission type becomes tiresome. Sequence 5 is a series of the same assassination. You talk to people consecutively and each one essentially says, "Another person has been assassinated. I'll mark it on your minimap." Just like many Bethesda titles, it's simply a game of follow the marker. Lacking any meaningful core like follow the marker is pernicious to the game it's in and also to the game's market as a whole, because it announces that a commercially successful game can get away with it, so it's permissible for other games to follow suit. Assassin's Tombs display a parallel problem. The root of it, however, is how the developers approached the tombs. What they are is a room or series of rooms effectively secluded from the rest of the game world. They are courses that the player must complete. Really, all of them are just a glorified 3D version of Connect the Dots. Annoyingly, puzzles is how they are described. A puzzle is a contrivance in which all of the information required to solve it is presented to the participant, and she must think creatively or intelligently to do so. A tomb is a timed obstacle course. The difference is stark, but ignoring how the developers thought of what they created, the tombs actually contain some of my favorite parts. The more challenging than the rest of the game, but whichever lobe of my brain houses frustration must have been getting in its pound of sweat for the day. Higher challenge offered as a result of an interesting mechanic is excellent, but that's not what was frustrating. Battling the controls, as I mentioned earlier, was the culprit. Wasted potential does come to mind. 6 of them are spread across all cities, and because there are so few of them and isolated from the overworld, they should all be unique. But they're not. Chasing a running Templar who's using improvised obstacles to divert your path is a compelling but reused mechanic. One tomb just glues 4 courses together. Like I said, because they're removed from the game, they're more consistently paced and persistently intriguing as an upshot. Certainly more so than the overworld. It makes the absence of creativity in these spaces abundantly more obvious. I enjoyed finding the entrances to the Assassin's Tombs more entertaining than going through them. They had so much more elbow room to do what they wanted, but the result is plain obstacle courses, sometimes that are only marginally less boring than the rest of the game. This means that they either weren't capable of a better design or they chose not to include one, and I'm not sure what's worse. Although they were one of the most successful spaces in the game, the concept doesn't agree with the concept of freerunning. Holding down 2 buttons accomplishes 98% of the freerunning motions. Because this is so simple and the player barely has to think about what they're doing on the controller, why script a sequence that must be completed? Understanding a scripted course is easy if complex operations have to be performed, but it's not the case. Making the course challenging would also justify their existence, but the courses are difficult in the same way catching an oiled fish in a tub of KY jelly is difficult. It doesn't require intelligent or creative thought, it's just frustrating and pointless. The lack of courtesy reaches within the missions themselves as well. Bartolomeo requests that Ezio find his men that were captured, release them, and escort them back to safety. 3 groups must be liberated, but once they're freed from the cage, an on-screen notification appears telling you that only 1 member from that group must survive. However, there are more than 3 members in each of the groups. So if only 1 member of the 3 groups must remain alive, why can't I keep 3 members of just 1 group alive and not waste my fucking time going after the others? Assassin's Creed 2 has so little respect for the player's time and also their intelligence, as if they can't see through the transparent bullshit like this littered throughout the game. I understand the idea of rescuing all of the groups of men, but then choose from a few options that aren't heinous contrivances. Ezio must continue rescuing the captured men until 3 return, or Ezio must rescue at minimum 1 person from each group, but not tell that to the player. It would maintain what's currently in place, but not make the player poke holes in the logic of it. The desynchronization upon failure would say that all members of that particular group died. Illustrating how AC2 doesn't give 2 shits on a nickel about the player is depressing and humiliating. To drive it even further into the ground, look at the portion of the mission when scouting the Palazzo Ducale has Ezio follow a specific path with Antonio to scout out the building for a future attack. On the last leg of the scouting, they are both on the ground level and find a way to the roof. But on the way to activate the last leg of this segment, it's easily possible to be on the roof just on the way to the objective. Then you must go to the ground level, then climb back up the way you just came. Events like these aren't uncommon, and they're overt. How many times I've mentioned and will mention the concept of free running is, I'm sure, unprecedented, but it's applicable in so many contexts. In a game about free running, if the player has the technical skill to reach a destination without guidance from the game, they should be able to do so instead of being arbitrarily restricted. A plain and uncomplicated solution is visible here. Have 2 objective markers. One is the official path that any player can follow. The other is optional so more skilled players can continue without assistance or guidance from the game. Both paths end up in the same place, but it wouldn't be dragging advanced players by their heels along a path that they could think of a better solution to. It would make the rails of the game less opaque and allow more player freedom, something AC2 desperately needs. As a whole, AC2 needs either more gimmick or more game. The gimmick missions prosper above the rest of the game for the same reasons that the tombs do. Isolation. Every gimmick segment of the game was engaging for me. The 2 most memorable ones are the horse carriage bit with Leonardo and using his flying machine, although for different reasons. Everything about the carriage segment is totally fine to me. I was more engaged playing that than many other points in the game, so much it was one of my favorite times up to that point, and I also look back at it favorably. Issues do surface with the flying machine. It would be paired with the carriage despite a glaring flaw. Ubisoft assumed that, although a large chunk of the city is available for flight, players would maintain their path along the bonfires. This makes sense, except for the fact that this game is about free running and being able to seek out and pursue one's own path. Common knowledge informs us that the fastest trajectory between 2 points is a straight line. So that is the first thing that I tried. I saw the marker on my minimap, used the 2 bonfires most adjacent to that straight line, and flew towards it. I arrived at the marker, saw the circle on the rooftop, attempted to get as near to it as possible, crashed, and desynchronized. I was very confused. Had I neglected to press a button to dismount? Was I too close to the marker? I really didn't know, so I tried several more times, but to the same effect. As it turns out, if you don't approach from the very specific intended direction, the cutscene won't trigger, safely placing Ezio on the rooftop. Surely I wasn't the only player to ever experience this. I'm going to use this example as a representative for how the concept of the game scarcely matches its executions. At least one of the concepts of this game is free running and being able to carve out a path that you want, or that you think is the best. Freerunning itself is about taking the most efficient route from one location to another. To me, moving in a straight line is a reasonable, logical approach considering that I'm flying and no other buildings are obstructing that line. But I was punished for taking the most efficient route. Assassin's Creed 2 attempts to put you on rails but doesn't do anything to ensure that you'll stay on them. And this isn't the only time it has happened. If the player can clearly see an open path that will work in getting them to where they need to be, why should the mission success be restricted to prevent that? In a game about free running, emphasis on free. Writing this sentence in the script is actually making me laugh because it's so blatantly obvious to me. Why wasn't this equally or even more obvious to the designers? The people whose job it is to be thinking about this stuff. I really don't get it. An otherwise great segment was partially spoiled because of poor and easily identifiable design flaw or oversight. I'm unsure where else to include the following bit, so it's going here. The Courtesans hurt from this the most, but the factions in the game show no indication when they will stop following you. It seems to be distance-based, but no attempts were made to convey this. Of course, the factions shouldn't follow you indefinitely until they become occupied with guards, but at least let the player know when they won't benefit from their presence anymore. Timing their departure instead of measuring it in distance might make more sense, but having the members of the faction talk about how bored they are and how they have better things that they could be doing would notify the player that they will soon be leaving. The first comment mentioning this would be, say, 10 seconds before they disengage, offering the player a consistent and predictable means of ensuring their safety once finally alone. One of the first flaws with AC2 is the hook of the plot, Ezio becoming an assassin. Losing 3 family members simultaneously in front of your eyes, perpetrated by a man your father trusted, is without any doubt a traumatic experience, and one I cannot relate to. Nothing even close to that has happened to me, yet I think it's sensible to believe that an otherwise well-adjusted teenager would not become a serial murderer out of vengeance. It's surprising that a teenager would make an intentional effort to slaughter a man, but I can believe it for the sake of the story if I'm to meet the game halfway. But not any further than that, definitely not becoming an assassin. I hypothesized that the writers needed Desmond to know how to find the apple, and they wanted the Spaniard to become the Pope to challenge Ezio for the apple, but didn't think about the interstitial steps. So they devised a plot that would involve Ezio assassinating increasingly higher profile figures, ultimately arriving at the Vatican to perform, but not actually perform, the final assassination. Either the writers didn't notice how absurd an otherwise mentally stable 17-year-old serial killer is, or they thought it was okay. Whether the former or latter is worse, again, I don't know. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the term Ludonarrative Dissonance at least once. This is when the information that is presented to the player, oftentimes in the story, isn't consistent with what the player is doing. To demonstrate this, some of the events in the plot seem to happen out of convenience rather than narrative logic. Near the beginning of the game, Ezio learns of an attack to happen to the Medicis and must hurry to prevent it. According to the game, Ezio is too late, but the player has to be only a few meters from the incoming attack for the cutscene to trigger. Several people are murdered, leaving only Lorenzo alive. Once Ezio is controllable again, he's right where the player left him, bad breath distance away from the event. He could have easily helped prevent all those killings from happening, but I guess the plot didn't want to. Then, when you have to escort Lorenzo to a safe place to be treated for his wound, he says, "I'm losing a lot of blood." Yet, he'll match your speed if you start sprinting. Just one more example is at the very end of the game when Warren shows up. Lucy tells Desmond to catch him. Warren is standing at the edge of the back of a truck. He's perfectly accessible to Desmond, but instead of going for him, the game wants you to fight all of the henchmen, letting Warren get away. It's all rather silly. Of course, there are also events that take place just to benefit Ezio or to justify the game's existence rather than make sense. 2 things happen when you first meet and start working with Mario. Ezio blindly begins working with him to finish Ezio's father's work that he's been laboring over for years, yet Mario doesn't tell us what the work is or how it involves Ezio. At no point does Ezio make an educated decision to follow Mario's suggestion or not. But the game needs to carry on, so Ezio's just going to do whatever the plot demands so it can. He brings his sister and mother, Claudia and Maria, along to keep them safe, but his sister hates Monteriggioni and wishes she was back in her home, yet moments later you witness her as the treasurer of the entire city sitting in Mario's home. Why? Well, the game needed some reason to keep track of your florins related to the town, and that's it. Other than Ezio's mother, there would be literally no other person more logical to make in charge of that position. And it's not a matter of trying to keep everyone in a house a relative because the architect is some random person. Architecture hadn't been really established as a profession back then, and women were especially aloof from this endeavor, but setting up Claudia even as only interested in buildings before the rest of the family died, and making her the architect would have solved this problem. The whole of how she would be able to completely renovate buildings if she was only interested in buildings would of course be present, but I think it to be favorable to the current situation. Some random person that previously worked at the bank should have been the treasurer. Even earlier in the game is Ezio's father telling him to find a hidden door in the house to find something special. Why is the father being purposely obscurantist? Why can't he just tell Ezio where to access it? It turns out, once again, it's to serve the game because it introduces the player to eagle vision. A less completely ham-fisted way of introducing this mechanic would have been to introduce glyphs earlier on to demonstrate to the player how to use eagle vision and also to look out for glyphs in the world. There is an aspect of the story that was somewhat clever. Although it wasn't a twist bigger than a Twizzler or a singular crepuscular ray of narrative brilliance puncturing through the thick clouds, the fact that all of Ezio's aides along the way were assassins was a great result. It was quite strange that so many people, many of whom were strangers, would do anything for Ezio after he did one favor for them. Considering that all of these people were cooperating to recruit and train him, it makes sense. Whether the creators of the story were completely aware of how obnoxious some of the loyalty became is irrelevant because it works out in the end. Speaking about the end, the final scene contains a member from a now extinct advanced race, Minerva, describing how they were eradicated by a catastrophic event that eradicated most life on Earth. She tells Ezio how their species created humans as workers but eventually rebelled and began fighting the creators. Reminds me of another species that created a worker race that ultimately rebelled. And there's some similar music too. No, really, the first time that I heard this piece of music, the first thing I thought of was Mass Effect. Have a listen. Mind you that Mass Effect released 2 years before Assassin's Creed 2. I'm not saying that anything insidious happens, just consider it a PSA. The OST for this game is quite pleasant. Just before this is the final boss, if you can call it that. A typical fistfight just like any other in the game, while receiving an exposition dump from the primary antagonist and waiting till he's done talking isn't much of a boss, is it? But after this fight, when Ezio has the opportunity to finally kill this man, he has some revelation that killing him won't bring back his family. It's quite curious that he didn't realize this somewhere among the dozens, if not hundreds of other people that he's killed. Not killing this man is not only frivolous in its own right, but also, why keep a narcissistic papal tyrant alive anyway? Ezio has at least 2 reasons to kill him, but doesn't. Some people are attracted to this game and Assassin's Creed games in general because of the setting. Gameplay and story take somewhat of a backseat to being able to roam freely about different cities in Italy. I want to say that I understand the value of pure experience. Video games are about generating experiences for players, whether that experience be fear, triumph, emotional tax, sorrow, the list goes on. These experiences can then incite reflection in the player and have them contemplate something new or think differently about something they were already aware of. Maybe somebody is coming to AC2 just to be in that place at that time. But that doesn't give the developers an excuse to make a poorly assembled game just because the setting and time are alluring to some people. Maybe Assassin's Creed is about basking in a setting instead of making a good game and is partially going over my head. This could be the case, but where's the line drawn? When is it no longer valid for a developer to say that players are meant to enjoy the setting and time and not necessarily play a finely crafted game? When does that become an excuse and a crutch rather than an intended experience? I don't have the answers to these questions, mainly because they're highly contextual, but in this game's case, there are too many elements present for it to be played as a game for it to be labeled simply as a historical experience. Reading all of the codices on the wall was one of the times I was most enjoying what was on the screen. Following the spiral of Altair, the author, into assassinhood was great, and the writing was quality as well. There were some potentially thought-provoking ideas like agnosticism that I didn't expect to find in the codices. One erroneous tidbit I did find is him talking about a flat earth. In one of the codices, Altair mentions Genghis Khan rise in the east. This happened about 250 years before Ezio, placing Altair in the 13th century. Now, the round earth was discovered as early as the 3rd century and as late as the 5th century, so I'm unsure why word hadn't spread to him yet. I'm not a historian, so maybe the truth of the round earth was suppressed for a long time, but several hundred years is a long time to keep a secret. Confusing as it is, Ezio learns different assassination techniques from different pages of codex throughout the game. They're deciphered by his best bud Leo, and then get thrown into a tutorial for that skill. On a side note, it is ludicrous that you still get tutorials hours into the game. How Ezio didn't think to jump and climb at the same time, or just fall and assassinate is beyond me, among other such trivial, blatant techniques. I debated with myself for quite a while whether to title this video either as a review or a critique. Even writing this now, I still haven't decided. On one hand, I had so many negative things to say about the game that I'm tempted to call it a critique. But on the other hand, this game is so unsuccessful in so many ways that it is indeed a review, but it sounds so disproportionately negative because the game is actually largely unsuccessful in its design. I suppose if you remember what I said in the introduction and looking at the title of this video, you'll know what my conclusion was. I mentioned just a second ago how much I like the writing in the codices, but the writing is so good that it ends up betraying itself. This excerpt from Codex number 7 approximates my view on Assassin's Creed 2 as a whole. It reads as follows. I hunted each man, one by one, until all responsible were gone from the world. But there was no joy in this, no satisfaction or release. Yes, my closest and most dearest assistant, Alessandro, has the only key to my secret lair of evilness. In case you did not know, he lives next to the door to the black... So awful.